So today we're jumping into one of the most difficult, frankly, one of the most disturbing passages in the entire Old Testament, Exodus chapter 32. I mean, this is a story that really makes you stop and ask some tough questions about God, about justice, and about violence. So let's dig in together and try to understand what was really going on at the foot of Mount Sinai. And there it is, right there in black and white. It's the command that just stops you cold. It comes from Moses on what seems to be God's authority, and it is just brutal. It's shocking, And it forces you to ask, how in the world does a verse like this end up in the Bible? And that really brings us to the core question of this whole thing. Was this a divine massacre, just an act of raw, angry punishment? Or, and this is the key, was something else happening here? Could this have been, in a strange and painful way, a kind of rescue mission? That's the puzzle we're going to try to solve. To even begin to understand the judgment, we first have to get a handle on the crime. So let's rewind. We need to set the scene and walk through exactly what happened that led to this absolute breaking point. What's just staggering is how fast this all went down. Moses is literally up on the mountain, receiving the 10 Commandments from God. And down in the camp, the people he just rescued from slavery are already starting to panic. They back his own brother Aaron into a corner and demand a God they can actually see. And what happens? The golden calf. And the party that follows, well, the original Hebrew makes it pretty clear this wasn't just a fun festival. It was a full-blown, immoral, idolatrous revelry. So when Moses finally comes down that mountain, he finds that the covenant has been shattered, and the camp is in a state of total moral chaos. Okay, so that's the what. But the much, much bigger question is why? This wasn't just God flying off the handle. When you really look at it, this moment was about the very survival of the nation of Israel, their survival as a people, and their survival in this new covenant with God. And that's what makes this so stunning. This wasn't just some small mistake. These are the same people who had literally just heard God's voice shake the mountain. They had verbally agreed to the whole deal, saying, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." And then, almost in the next breath, they build a replacement. This was high-handed, open rebellion. And you have to understand what was at stake. I mean, this was an existential threat. If this rebellion was just allowed to continue, Israel as a distinct nation would have basically dissolved. They would lose their moral compass, they would look exactly like the pagan Egypt they were just freed from, and they would have destroyed the very family line that the Messiah was promised to come through. The whole national project was right there on the brink of self-destructing. Now, to really get what happens next, we have to talk numbers for a second. Let's get some perspective. Look at this. There were over 600,000 men in the camp, and that's just the men of fighting age, not even counting women and children. We are talking about a massive community, a brand new nation of probably millions of people. Okay, now look at this number. About 3,000 men died. When you put those two numbers right next to each other, a completely different story starts to take shape, doesn't it? This was not an act of total annihilation. It wasn't God wiping everyone out. It was targeted. And in a very real way, it was actually restrained. And that leads us to this really helpful idea, thinking of this as a kind of spiritual quarantine. It was a painful surgical act designed to cut out a moral plague that was about to infect and kill the entire nation from within. The goal here wasn't just to punish, it was to preserve. And we can see just how targeted this was when we look closer at the actual words Moses uses. The language itself gives us clues that this was a controlled legal process, not just some chaotic rampage. For instance, Moses tells the Levites to go from gate to gate. Now, that might not sound like much, but it's a huge clue. This is not the language of a mob running wild. An ancient camp like this was highly structured, and the gates were official points of entry and control. The phrase suggests an organized judicial patrol, not random violence. And what about that really disturbing part, kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor? Well, it turns out this phrase is a known legal formula in the Old Testament. It's not a command to just kill indiscriminately. It's actually a command for impartiality. What it's really saying is, carry out this judgment without playing favorites. Don't spare someone just because he's your friend or your brother. It's about equal justice, not random killing. So when you put all those clues together, the picture gets a lot clearer. The Levites weren't just running around killing people at random. The command was specific. It targeted the ringleaders, the ones who were visibly and actively leading this idolatrous party. They didn't have to be mind readers. The guilt was out in the open for everyone to see. Okay, so we've seen that the action was judicial, it was targeted, it was restrained, but that still leaves us with this huge theological question, right? How can an act this severe ever be considered loving or merciful? Let's dive right into that tension.
This analogy is probably the best way to wrap our minds around it. You see, biblical love isn't just a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's active, it protects. A good surgeon has to make a painful cut to remove a cancer and save a life. And in the same way, this judgment, as awful as it was necessary to save the entire people from spiritual death. To do nothing would have been the unloving thing to do.
And what's really amazing is when you look again, you start to see threads of mercy woven throughout this whole dark story. I mean, think about it. God could have justifiably destroyed the whole nation right then and there, but he didn't. He actually listened to Moses' passionate prayer for the people. The judgment was limited, and maybe most importantly, God didn't break his covenant. He stuck with Israel.
But all of this leads to maybe the most glaring question in the whole chapter. If this was about justice, why in the world was Aaron, the guy who literally made the golden calf, why was he spared? The answer, believe it or not, isn't even in the book of Exodus. We find it much later, when Moses is retelling the story in Deuteronomy. It turns out God was angry enough with Aaron to destroy him. But Moses prayed for him. Moses interceded for his brother. Aaron was spared because someone else stood in the gap on his behalf. But, and this is a really big but, being spared from death did not mean he was excused. Not at all. Mercy kept him alive, but it didn't just wipe the slate clean. Instead, it gave him a lifetime for discipline and consequences to shape him. And believe me, Aaron paid a heavy price for his failure for the rest of his life. He had to stand by and watch his own 2 sons die under God's judgment. He, just like Moses, was forbidden from ever entering the Promised Land. His leadership was constantly questioned, and his entire priesthood was forever stained by this one moment of catastrophic failure. So, let's pull all these threads together. What's the final verdict here? When we step back from this difficult moment at Sinai, what does it ultimately show us about God, justice, and sacrifice? And this is where it all clicks into place. What Exodus 32 really does is it gives us this unforgettable, stark picture of what justice looks like without a substitute. At Sinai, the guilty have to die so that the innocent can live. But this whole event is a shadow, pointing forward to a different mountain, to Calvary, where that entire divine equation gets flipped on its head. On the cross, the innocent one dies so that the guilty can live. Sinai shows us the disease, Calvary shows us the cure. And so we end right where Moses began. He stood at the entrance to the camp, and he shouted a question. And it wasn't just a question for that day, it's a question for all time. It wasn't about who felt religious or who had the right beliefs in their head. It was a call for a visible public allegiance when everything was on the line. And that question, who is on the Lord's side? Well, it still hangs in the air today.